A judge sends an innocent black woman to prison, unaware she's an undercover attorney general on a secret mission to expose everything he stands for. He thinks he's closing the case, but she's just getting started. With every day behind bars, she's gathering names, digging through lies, and building a case that could bring down the very courtroom that locked her away. But here's the twist. This isn't just revenge, it's personal. What happens when the woman they tried to silence turns out to be the system's biggest threat? And when the truth finally hits the bench, who will be left standing? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. On a cold winter morning, Judge Nathaniel Ross pulled his black wool coat tighter as he climbed the courthouse steps. His breath made little clouds in the frosty air. The marble steps, worn smooth by years of footsteps, felt especially hard today. Inside, the warmth hit him like a wall. He nodded at the security guards who knew him well after 15 years on the bench. Judge Ross prided himself on punctuality. He was always first to arrive, last to leave. "Good morning, Your Honor," Valerie Lynn said, appearing at his side with a steaming cup of coffee. Black, no sugar, just as he preferred. Her efficiency was why he'd requested her as his court assistant 3 years ago. "Morning, Valerie. What's on the docket today?" He took the cup, grateful for its warmth. "The Jefferson embezzlement case, sir. The defendant allegedly stole funds from the West Side Women's Shelter." Valerie handed him a manila folder. "The prosecutor is pushing hard on this one." "Strick?" Ross asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes, sir. Alan Strick." Valerie hesitated. "There's been some talk about racial politics in this case. The community center serves primarily women of color, and the defendant is—" "I don't need those details, Valerie," Ross cut her off. "The law doesn't see color, and neither do I. Facts and evidence. That's all that matters in my courtroom." Valerie's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind her eyes. "Of course, Your Honor." The courtroom was hushed as Maya Jefferson sat at the defense table. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her posture straight but not stiff. To anyone watching, she appeared calm, but her eyes missed nothing. They tracked every movement, noted every whisper. Her court-appointed attorney shuffled papers beside her, flipping through documents he clearly hadn't reviewed until this morning. Maya watched him from the corner of her eye but said nothing. Alan Strick approached the bench with confidence that bordered on swagger. His tailored suit and perfect Windsor knot spoke of a man who understood the power of appearances. "Your Honor," Strick began, his voice carrying to the back of the room without effort, "the state will prove that the defendant, Maya Jefferson, abused her position of trust to steal $30,000 meant for vulnerable women and children." Judge Ross nodded, his face a mask of impartiality. "Proceed, Mr. Strick." As Strick outlined the case, painting a picture of calculated theft and betrayal, Maya's public defender fidgeted with his pen. When it was his turn to speak, he stumbled through his opening statement, forgetting key points and twice referring to notes that weren't properly organized. Maya's expression never changed, but her eyes narrowed slightly. When the court recessed for lunch, Maya stood on the courthouse steps, breathing in the cold air. Across the street, partially hidden by a bare oak tree, stood a tall man in a gray coat. His face was unremarkable, but his posture was alert, watchful. Their eyes met. A small nod passed between them. So subtle it could have been mistaken for the natural movement of someone adjusting their stance. The bailiff, Thomas Green, held the door open behind her. "Ms. Jefferson, your attorney is looking for you." Maya turned away from the stranger. "Thank you," she said quietly, and walked back into the courthouse where her fate was being decided by people who thought they knew the whole story. As the days passed, Judge Nathaniel Ross found himself increasingly troubled by the Jefferson case. During lunch in his chambers, he unwrapped his turkey sandwich while Valerie Lynn organized files on his desk. "What do you make of the defendant, Valerie?" he asked, breaking their usual professional silence. Valerie looked up, surprised. "Maya Jefferson? She's composed." "Too composed," Ross said, taking a bite of his sandwich. "Too calm for someone guilty of what they're accusing her of. Most embezzlers I've seen are nervous wrecks by now." "Perhaps she's innocent?" Valerie suggested quietly. Ross frowned. "The evidence Strick presented is enough." He paused, remembering the bank statements, the transfers. But something doesn't add up. The timing of the transfers? Valerie asked, her voice careful. That and her background. 15 years working with vulnerable communities, spotless record, then suddenly she steals from the very people she's dedicated her life to helping? Ross shook his head. It's unusual. People can surprise you, Valerie said, though her tone suggested she wasn't convinced either. Yes, they can. Ross sighed heavily. But the law is the law. Evidence is evidence. Valerie nodded and returned to her filing, but the doubt had settled between them like a third presence in the room. In her holding cell, Maya sat cross-legged on the narrow bed. Her hands moved steadily across the pages of a small notebook hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible. Her handwriting was neat, precise, documenting times, dates, exact words spoken. Across the cell, Teresa Miles watched from her own bed. Teresa had been there 3 weeks already, waiting for her drug possession trial. She'd noticed Maya's daily ritual but never mentioned it. Today, though, curiosity got the better of her. "What you writing in there that's so important?" Teresa asked. Maya looked up, her eyes calm but watchful. "Just thoughts. Helps me stay focused." Teresa nodded slowly. "Smart. This place messes with your head if you let it." She paused. "You don't seem like you belong here." A small smile touched Maya's lips. "None of us do, Teresa." When footsteps approached, Maya quickly slid the notebook back into its hiding place and closed the Bible. The guard appeared, keys jangling. "Jefferson, back to court, let's go." The afternoon session felt heavier than the morning. The cross-examination had ended, and Maya had maintained her innocence throughout, her voice never wavering. "I did not take that money," she had stated firmly when Strick pressed her about the transfers. Now, as closing arguments approached, Maya sat straight-backed at the defense table. She could feel the jury's eyes on her, 12 people who would decide her fate. She noted their expressions, doubt, suspicion, and something else that made her heart sink, preconceived judgment. Alan Strick paced before them, his voice resonant with righteous indignation. "The evidence is clear. Ms. Jefferson had access, opportunity, and motive. Her calm demeanor isn't innocence, it's calculation." From the bench, Judge Ross watched the jury's reactions. Several nodded along with Strick's words. He saw how they looked at Maya, not seeing the dedicated community worker with an unblemished record, but the stereotype Strick had skillfully painted: calculating, cold, criminal. The court clerk passed Ross a note. He glanced at it, then at the clock. Time was moving forward, and with it, the case toward its inevitable conclusion. By the time Judge Nathaniel Ross walked into the courtroom for the sentencing, the press had already arrived, sensing a controversial verdict. The wooden benches creaked with the weight of reporters, their notebooks open and pens poised. Camera flashes were strictly forbidden, but the journalists' eager eyes captured everything. The tense atmosphere, the rigid posture of the bailiff, the solemn faces of the few spectators. Ross adjusted his black robes as he took his seat at the bench. His gaze swept across the room, noting the unusual number of press representatives. The Jefferson case had grown from a simple embezzlement trial into something that had caught public attention. Perhaps it was the nature of the crime, money stolen from a women's shelter. Or perhaps it was Maya Jefferson herself, with her impeccable record and unwavering claims of innocence. Valerie Lynn stood near his bench, her face carefully blank, though Ross noticed how tightly she clutched the case files. When their eyes met briefly, she looked away. "All rise," the bailiff called out. "Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Nathaniel Ross presiding." The room fell silent as Maya Jefferson was led in. She wore the same cream-colored blouse she'd worn throughout the trial, her hair pulled back neatly. Her eyes, calm and clear, met Ross's without flinching. The sentencing was swift. Despite the doubts that had plagued him for days, despite the questions that still lingered in his mind, Judge Ross cleared his throat and delivered the verdict with the authority expected of him. "Maya Jefferson, you have been found guilty of embezzlement of funds from the New Hope Women's Shelter. This court sentences you to 5 years in federal prison." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ross noticed a muscle twitch in Maya's jaw, the first crack in her composure he'd seen since the trial began. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite everything. "I maintain my innocence." "The jury has found otherwise, Ms. Jefferson," Ross replied, his tone firmer than he felt. "This court stands by their decision." As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, Maya stood tall. The metal clicked around her wrists, the sound sharp in the hushed courtroom. Ross watched her face, searching for anger, for fear, for any sign that might confirm the guilt the jury had assigned to her. He found none. Then, as she turned to be led away, Maya's gaze shifted to someone in the gallery, the same tall man in the gray coat who had been watching from across the street days earlier. Now seated inside the courtroom, the man's expression remained impassive, but his eyes locked with Maya's in what could only be described as a meaningful glance. The man tapped his watch twice, a gesture so subtle that Ross might have missed it if he hadn't been watching so intently. Maya gave an almost imperceptible nod before turning away. Something cold settled in Ross's stomach. Something was in motion, something beyond this courtroom, beyond this verdict. The bailiff led Maya toward the exit as reporters rushed to file their stories. Valerie Lynn stood frozen beside the bench, her knuckles white around the case files. After a few weeks in the Lakeside Women's Correctional Facility, Maya settled into a careful routine. The prison walls, painted a dull beige that was peeling in places, became familiar. The constant noise, metal doors clanging shut, guards shouting commands, women arguing or crying in their cells, faded into background noise that Maya's mind filtered through for important information. She watched everything with quiet intensity. Who had power? Who was vulnerable? Which guards could be trusted? Which couldn't? Teresa Miles, her cellmate who had noticed Maya's hidden journal, became an unexpected ally. Teresa was serving 3 years for check fraud and had a talent for knowing prison gossip before it even happened. "New fish coming in today," Teresa whispered during breakfast in the crowded cafeteria. "Word is, she's some big-shot nurse who got caught stealing meds." Maya nodded, filing away the information. "Thanks, T." Later that day, Maya met Ruth Coleman in the laundry room. The former nurse was in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and hands that still moved with medical precision despite her surroundings. 25 years of saving lives," Ruth said bitterly as she folded sheets alongside Maya. "And one mistake, trying to help my son who was in pain, and I'm here for 8 years." Maya listened, her eyes soft with understanding. Sometimes the system fails the very people it's supposed to protect. Ruth looked up, surprised by Maya's words. "You don't talk like most women in here." "I've had time to think about justice," Maya replied simply. Word spread quickly that Maya Jefferson was different. She didn't fight. She didn't gossip. But somehow, when 2 inmates were about to attack a young first-timer in the yard, Maya's quiet words stopped them cold. She commanded respect without raising her voice. In the prison library, Maya built another important relationship. Leonard Briggs, a middle-aged man with thick glasses and a passion for books, had run the prison library for 15 years. "Ms. Jefferson," he greeted her warmly one afternoon. "Back again? You're my most dedicated reader." Maya smiled. "I've always believed knowledge is freedom, Mr. Briggs." Over time, she earned his trust. When she asked for access to legal records for personal research, Leonard bent the rules. "Don't tell anyone I let you see these," he whispered, sliding over files that inmates normally wouldn't be allowed to touch. Maya's eyes lit up at the treasure trove of information. Case files, court records, names and dates that connected dots in a pattern only she could see. She wasn't just surviving prison, she was gathering intelligence. One evening after mail call, Maya sat alone in her cell writing a letter. Teresa was at movie night, giving Maya rare privacy. Her pen moved quickly across the paper, her words carefully coded in a system that looked like innocent chatter about prison life. The next morning, she handed the sealed envelope to a guard for outgoing mail. It was addressed to a P.O. box in Washington, D.C. In the corner where a return address should be, she had neatly written MJAG. Warden Gina Howell passed by as Maya handed over the letter. The stern-faced woman with salt and pepper hair paused, studying Maya with narrowed eyes. "Jefferson," she acknowledged with a curt nod. "Staying out of trouble?" Maya smiled politely. "Always, Warden, just trying to serve my time." The warden moved on, unaware that beneath Maya's quiet demeanor, a mission was unfolding, one that reached far beyond these prison walls. 15 years earlier, the courtroom was hushed as Rosa Jefferson stood before Judge Nathaniel Ross. At 45, Rosa's face showed the strain of 3 years in prison, but she held herself with quiet dignity. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a worn manila folder containing evidence of her innocence. "Your Honor," Rosa's voice was steady despite her fear, "I've been wrongfully convicted. The new evidence shows that the accounting discrepancies were caused by software errors, not embezzlement." Judge Ross, then in his early 40s with fewer lines on his face and ambition burning in his eyes, barely looked up from the papers before him. His reputation as a tough-on-crime judge was still being built, case by case. "Mrs. Jefferson, the jury found you guilty. The appeals process has run its course." His voice was clipped, impatient. "Your motion for clemency is denied." In the gallery, 22-year-old Maya Jefferson sat rigid, her fingernails digging into her palms. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, trying to look professional, trying to believe the system would work. As the gavel came down with a sharp crack, Maya felt something break inside her. Her mother's shoulders slumped in defeat as the court officers approached to take her back to prison. "Mom!" Maya called out, rising to her feet. Rosa turned, her eyes filled with tears but also with fierce pride. "Keep studying, baby. Change it from the inside." Maya watched, helpless, as they led her mother away. Judge Ross was already calling the next case, not seeing, or not caring about, the devastation he'd just caused. Maya's eyes burned into his profile, memorizing every detail of the man who had dismissed her mother's life so easily. "I'll find a way," she whispered to herself. "I'll tear it all down." 3 years later, Maya stood in a cap and gown, valedictorian of her Yale law class. Her professors called her brilliant and meticulous. Classmates both admired and feared her laser focus, her ability to dismantle legal arguments with surgical precision. What they didn't know was that every late night in the library, every perfect exam, every moot court victory was fueled by a promise made in that courtroom. After the ceremony, as students celebrated with family, Maya stood alone. Her mother had died in prison the year before, complications from untreated pneumonia. "Ms. Jefferson?" A tall man in a charcoal suit approached. "Marcus Holloway, Department of Justice." Maya's expression remained neutral. "How can I help you, Mr. Holloway?" "Actually," he said quietly, "I believe we can help each other. Your academic record is extraordinary, but it's your personal history that interests us most." He handed her a business card with only a phone number. "We've been watching your progress. There are ways to change the system that few people ever see." His eyes held hers meaningfully. "If you're interested in real justice, call that number." Maya looked down at the card, then back at the man. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. "I'll call tomorrow," she said. In the meantime, Judge Nathaniel Ross found himself increasingly troubled. The Jefferson case should have been closed, filed away among the hundreds of others he'd presided over. But something about it lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. The first crack in his carefully constructed world appeared on a Tuesday morning. Valerie Lynn, his assistant of 4 years, placed a simple white envelope on his desk. "What's this?" he asked, barely looking up from his docket. "My resignation, effective immediately." Valerie's voice was quiet but firm. Now she had his attention. Ross set down his pen. "Resignation? You've been talking about the district court appointment for months." Valerie clasped her hands together. "I can't continue here, Your Honor." "Can't continue? Why?" "Moral dissonance." The words hung in the air between them. "There are things happening in this courthouse that I can no longer be part of." Ross frowned. "If there's misconduct, you should report it through proper channels." "The proper channels are part of the problem. Valerie's eyes held his for a moment. "I hope someday you'll see what's right in front of you." Before he could respond, she turned and walked out, leaving Ross staring at the empty doorway. 2 weeks passed. Ross hired a new assistant, but the unease remained. Then came the envelope. It appeared on his desk during lunch. No postmark, no return address. Inside was a single file folder marked Jefferson Case, Suppressed Evidence. His hands grew cold as he flipped through the pages. Witness statements that contradicted the prosecution's timeline. Bank records showing transactions made while Maya was in a documented meeting. Emails suggesting the shelter's director had financial troubles. None of this had been presented at trial. At the bottom was a yellow post-it note. How many others? Ross locked the file in his desk drawer, his heart pounding. If this was authentic, it meant the prosecution had deliberately withheld exculpatory evidence, a serious ethics violation, and he had sentenced an innocent woman to prison. That evening, as dusk painted his chambers in shades of orange and purple, Ross sat alone with Maya Jefferson's trial transcript spread before him. He'd been reviewing it for hours, seeing patterns he'd missed before, leading questions that went unchallenged, objections from the defense that he'd dismissed too quickly. "What did I miss?" he whispered to the empty room. Clerk Ellen Pearson knocked softly before entering with a stack of files. "Working late again, Judge?" Ross didn't look up. "Ellen, do you remember the Jefferson case? The embezzlement from the women's shelter?" "Of course." The defendant was so composed, almost like she knew something we didn't. Ross tapped his finger on the transcript. Maybe she did. After Ellen left, Ross continued reading, a growing sense of dread building in his stomach. The careful facade he'd built, of impartiality, of justice served, was beginning to crumble. For the first time in his career, Judge Nathaniel Ross allowed himself to consider a terrifying possibility, that the system he'd devoted his life to might be fundamentally broken, and worse, that he had been complicit in its failures. At that moment, Judge Nathaniel Ross's finger froze on line 217 of the transcript. He read it again, then again, his brow furrowing deeper each time. Exhibit 32B referenced during discovery proceedings. Ross flipped through the evidence log, scanning each entry. There was no Exhibit 32B listed anywhere. He checked the prosecution's discovery submissions. Nothing. The defense's requests. Nothing. Yet here it was, clearly mentioned in the transcript, then never addressed again, as if it had vanished into thin air. Ross gathered the files and walked briskly to the court archives. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Ellen Pearson looked up from her computer. "Ellen, I need the complete evidence catalog for the Jefferson case." Ellen's smile faltered. "You have the complete catalog, Your Honor." "No." Ross placed the transcript on her desk, pointing to the reference. "There's mention of an Exhibit 32B that's missing from the record." Ellen's eyes darted to the page, then away. She stood and walked to a filing cabinet, her back to him. "Some files are administratively sealed," she said quietly. "Sealed? By whose authority?" Ellen turned, her face pale. "Prosecutor Strick has certain privileges. Some evidence is sealed at his discretion." Ross felt his chest tighten. "That's not how the system works, Ellen." "It's how this system works." Ellen leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Judge Ross, I have 3 years until retirement. Please, let this go. You don't understand what you're digging into." "I think I'm beginning to." That evening, Ross drove to Alan Strick's colonial-style home in the affluent North Side. Christmas lights outlined the perfect roofline, though the holiday was still weeks away. Strick answered the door in casual clothes, surprise quickly masked by his practiced smile. "Judge Ross, to what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" "We need to talk about the Jefferson case." Strick's smile dimmed. He gestured Ross inside to a living room that looked like it belonged in a magazine, not a book out of place, not a cushion unfluffed. "What about it?" "Case closed, justice served." Strick poured himself a scotch without offering one to Ross. "Exhibit 32B, what was it?" Strick's hand paused mid-pour. "Excuse me?" Evidence mentioned during discovery but never entered into the record. Ellen Pearson says you had it sealed. Strick set down his glass. Judge, with all due respect, administrative procedures for evidence management. Don't. Ross's voice was sharp. Don't hide behind bureaucratic language. What was in that exhibit? Strick's friendly facade fell away. Nothing relevant to the case outcome. That's not your determination to make. It absolutely is. Strick's eyes hardened. And frankly, Nathaniel, your sudden interest in procedural minutia is concerning. You've never questioned my methods before. Maybe I should have. Strick laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Your appointment to the bench wasn't an accident. The governor appreciated your reliability, your ability to not ask too many questions. Ross felt as if the floor was tilting beneath him. Are you implying my appointment was politically motivated? I'm stating it plainly. Strick moved closer. We've all benefited from the system as it is. Your conviction rates look good for re-election. My win record advances my career. The prison industrial complex gets its bodies, everyone wins. Except the innocent. Alleged innocent. Strick's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. Think carefully about the path you're choosing, Judge. You've built a respectable career by playing along. Don't throw it away now. Earlier that day in prison, Maya Jefferson sat across from Warden Gina Howell in the administration office. The room was small but tidy, with certificates hanging on pale green walls and a single potted plant that had seen better days. Jefferson, I've been reviewing your file, Warden Howell said, adjusting her glasses. Your behavior has been exemplary. No incidents, regular participation in the library program, and positive reports from all staff. Maya nodded slightly, her face revealing nothing. The Reform Review Act has created a pathway for select inmates with your profile. The warden slid a folder across the desk. You're being considered for early release. The board meets next month. Thank you, Warden, Maya said quietly. Her voice was calm, but her mind was racing. This aligned perfectly with her mission timeline. I appreciate the consideration. Don't thank me yet, Warden Howell said with a thin smile. The review process is thorough, but I thought you should know. As Maya left the office, she caught Teresa Miles's eye in the hallway. Teresa gave her a subtle nod before continuing on her way to kitchen duty. Later that afternoon, Maya was escorted to what was officially designated as a spiritual counseling cell. The guard left her there alone, and 3 minutes later, the tall man in the gray coat, Agent Eric Daniels, entered through a side door. We don't have much time, he said, keeping his voice low. Maya sat on the small bench. What's happening outside? The judge is starting to ask questions. Daniels glanced at the door. But there's something else you should know. Valerie Lynn may have been a plant all along. Maya's eyes widened slightly. Working for whom? That's what's interesting. She was initially placed in the courthouse to observe and report on the judge's handling of certain cases, but she developed a conscience, exited the mission early. So she wasn't just a court assistant. Maya processed this new information. Who was she reporting to? That's where it gets murky. On paper, she was vetted by the state prosecutor's office, but her credentials trace back to a shell company with federal connections. Maya rubbed her temples. This goes deeper than we thought. The corruption might reach into DOJ circles. That's a serious accusation. I know. Maya leaned forward. I need you to send a secure file to M.H. Marcus Holloway? Your supervisor? Daniels looked surprised. Yes, but use the secure channel only. I'm not sure who we can trust anymore. Maya's voice dropped even lower. The file is in my personal effects. The journal looks like random notes, but the third page has a microdot under the period at the end of the second paragraph. Daniels nodded. I'll handle it personally. Be careful, Eric. If I'm right about this, we're not just dealing with a corrupt judge and prosecutor. This could be systemic. Time's up, he said, hearing footsteps approaching. Stay safe in here. Your release is coming. As Daniels slipped out the side door, Maya composed herself. The pieces were falling into place, but the puzzle was bigger and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. As time went on, Judge Nathaniel Ross transformed his home office into an investigative hub. Files from the courthouse archives, officially signed out for judicial review, lay spread across his mahogany desk. Yellow legal pads filled with his neat handwriting covered every surface. 3 weeks had passed since his confrontation with Strick, and sleep had become a luxury Ross could no longer afford. Case 2018 CR 47, he muttered, flipping through dog-eared pages. Prosecutor Strick again. Evidence of prior relationship between witness and defendant never entered into record. Ross pushed his reading glasses up and rubbed his tired eyes. The clock read 2:17 a.m. He added another yellow sticky note to his growing collection on the wall. Pattern after pattern emerged. Certain prosecutors, Strick most prominently, appeared in cases with troubling similarities. Evidence that should have been disclosed during discovery mysteriously absent. Witnesses whose credibility should have been questioned were presented as ironclad, and Ross had presided over it all, blind to or willfully ignoring what was happening in his own courtroom. Dear God, he whispered, staring at the names. So many lives affected, so many years stolen. The next morning, Ross drove to Lakeside Retirement Community. The grounds were peaceful, with flowering trees and residents strolling along paved paths. He found Henry Winslow sitting on a bench overlooking the water, feeding ducks. Nathaniel, the older man said without turning around, I wondered when you might visit. Ross sat beside his former mentor. Winslow had retired 5 years earlier, after 30 years on the bench. His hair was whiter now, his face more lined, but his eyes remained sharp. I need to ask you something, Henry, Ross began. Did you ever notice irregularities in cases prosecuted by Alan Strick? Winslow's hand paused mid-throw, breadcrumbs falling to the ground. Why do you ask? Because I'm finding disturbing patterns in my own courtroom, cases where evidence was suppressed, where innocent people may have been convicted. The retired judge was quiet for a long moment. My last 3 years on the bench, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I began noticing similar issues. When I raised concerns, I received a visit from the Chief Justice and the District Attorney. What did they say? That my retirement package could be very comfortable if I focused on wrapping up my remaining cases without complications. Winslow's gaze remained fixed on the lake. Or very uncomfortable if I didn't. So you knew, Ross said, his voice hollow. I suspected, and I chose comfort over courage. Winslow finally turned to face him. Don't make the same mistake, Nathaniel. That night, Ross stood in his home office, staring at what his wall had become. Red string-connected photos, names, and cases. Maya Jefferson's face was just one among dozens. Each string represented a life derailed, a family torn apart. Each connection pointed to a system Ross had faithfully served, and that had used his authority to perpetuate injustice. The weight of it all pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. He sank into his chair, head in his hands. For the first time since he was a child, Judge Nathaniel Ross wept openly, his shoulders shaking with the unbearable knowledge of what he had done and what he had failed to do. The next morning, Alan Strick adjusted his Italian silk tie as he waited in the private dining room at Bellini's, an upscale restaurant downtown. The room was reserved for those who could afford both the steep prices and the privacy. When Councilman Douglas Ward entered, Strick rose with a practiced smile. Douglas, good to see you, Strick said, extending his hand. The councilman, a broad-shouldered man with silver-streaked hair, returned the handshake firmly. Alan, let's skip the pleasantries. I hear we have a problem. Once seated, with coffee poured and the server dismissed, Strick leaned forward. Judge Ross is digging through old case files. He's asking questions about evidence handling, witness testimony, things that were settled years ago. Ward frowned, stirring his coffee slowly. That's concerning. The conviction quota legacy we've built has served us both well. Your conviction rate makes you look tough on crime. My tough on crime platform keeps me in office. And the private prison contracts keep campaign donations flowing, Strick added quietly. Exactly. Ward's voice hardened. So how do we keep Judge Ross under control? Strick smiled thinly. I've already taken some initial steps, a reminder that his career advancement depends on being a team player, but he might need more direct persuasion. Handle it, Ward said, checking his watch. Just make sure it can't be traced back to either of us. We have too much at stake. As they parted ways, Ward added, the police commissioner's retirement dinner is next month. I expect this Ross situation to be resolved by then. Across town, Judge Nathaniel Ross pulled into the courthouse parking garage, his mind still heavy with the revelations of the past weeks. As he approached his reserved space, he slowed his car to a stop. Bold white spray paint defaced the concrete wall behind his parking spot. Stick to the bench. Ross felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He parked anyway, hands slightly trembling as he gathered his briefcase. The message was clear. Someone knew he was investigating, and they weren't happy about it. As he walked toward the elevator, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. They're watching you now. Be careful. V. Valerie Lynn, his former assistant who had quit so abruptly. Ross glanced around the parking garage, suddenly aware of the security cameras, wondering who might be monitoring them. Meanwhile, in the prison library, Maya Jefferson sorted legal texts with methodical precision. The prison librarian, Leonard Briggs, approached with a newspaper. Thought you might find this interesting, he said quietly, sliding it across the desk. The headline read, Sealed Court Files Leaked to Press. Questions of Judicial Misconduct Surface. A small smile played at the corners of Maya's mouth as she scanned the article. The files she had carefully documented and passed through her network were finally seeing daylight. Thank you, Leonard, she said, keeping her voice neutral despite the triumph she felt inside. Later in her cell, Maya received a coded message from Agent Daniels. Package delivered. Timeline accelerated. Prepare for extraction within 72 hours. Maya closed her eyes briefly. After years of planning and months of careful execution, justice was finally within reach. The corruption that had stolen her mother's life and countless others was being exposed. Her time was coming soon, and with it, the reckoning she had worked so hard to bring about. Just then, as Judge Nathaniel Ross sat in his chambers, ready to file away his concerns and return to his regular duties, his television flickered with breaking news. The somber-faced anchor appeared with urgency in her voice. Breaking news tonight. Sealed court documents have been leaked to multiple media outlets showing that critical evidence was deliberately withheld in the high-profile embezzlement case of Maya Jefferson. Ross froze, remote control still pointed at the screen. His mouth went dry as the anchor continued. The documents reveal that Jefferson's financial records, which would have proven her innocence, were intentionally suppressed by the prosecution, with the apparent knowledge of court officials. The television showed Maya's courthouse photo, her calm eyes staring directly at the camera. Ross felt those eyes boring into him now. My God, he whispered, sinking back into his chair. His phone began ringing incessantly. First his clerk, then the chief judge, then numbers he didn't recognize. Within the hour, social media had exploded with the hashtag number Justice for Maya trending nationwide. By evening, the courthouse steps were crowded with protesters holding signs, Free Maya Now, and Corrupt Courts. News vans lined the street, reporters speaking urgently into cameras as the crowd's chants echoed behind them. Judge Nathaniel Ross, who presided over the Jefferson case, has not responded to requests for comment, one reporter stated, the courthouse visible in the background. Inside, Ross was summoned to an emergency meeting with the Judicial Conduct Committee. 5 stern-faced colleagues sat around a polished table, a tablet displaying the leaked documents between them. Nathaniel, Judge Eleanor Winters began, these allegations are extremely serious. If there was evidence suppression in your courtroom— I didn't know, Ross interrupted, his voice hoarse. But I should have. I started looking into it recently, but I didn't dig deep enough. That's not good enough, Judge Michael Patel responded sharply. Either you were complicit or negligent. Neither reflects well on this court. Ross nodded slowly, the weight of his failure crushing him. I understand. Meanwhile, in a secure government office in Washington, D.C., Agent Eric Daniels stood before Marcus Holloway, the Department of Justice supervisor who had recruited Maya years ago. "The documents have had the desired effect," Daniels reported. "Public outrage is exactly what we needed to force action." Holloway nodded, reviewing the file before him. "Approval for Jefferson's release under immediate review has been granted. We need her testimony to bring down the entire network." "And Judge Ross?" Daniels asked. "Arrange a private meeting between them, supervised, of course." Holloway's eyes narrowed. "Ross needs to understand exactly what happened in his courtroom. Maya deserves that much." "Yes, sir," Daniels replied, already typing the authorization code into his secure phone. "I'll make the arrangements immediately." The message was sent to the prison warden. Maya Jefferson would be leaving her cell within hours, not as a convicted felon, but as a federal witness whose years of undercover work were about to expose one of the largest judicial corruption scandals in the state's history. At dusk, the prison's side exit door opened with a metallic groan. Maya Jefferson stepped out, blinking in the fading orange light, her first taste of freedom in months. The cool evening air brushed against her face, a stark contrast to the stale atmosphere she'd grown accustomed to inside. Warden Gina Howell stood beside her, maintaining a professional distance. "The paperwork's been expedited. You're free to go, Ms. Jefferson." Maya nodded silently, savoring the moment. A black government SUV waited nearby, its engine humming quietly. "Your belongings," the warden said, handing over a small plastic bag containing the few personal items Maya had when she entered the prison. "Thank you," Maya replied, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. Agent Eric Daniels emerged from the vehicle, opening the passenger door. "We should move quickly." Maya followed him to a nearby building where a small room had been prepared. Inside, she found a garment bag hanging on a hook. She unzipped it to reveal a crisp navy suit. Not prison-issued clothes, but the professional attire of her true identity. Minutes later, Maya stood transformed. The orange jumpsuit was gone, replaced by the tailored suit that fit her perfectly. Her hair, neatly styled, framed a face that looked years younger without the weight of her prison persona. She was no longer inmate number 45,721. She was Maya Jefferson, attorney at law, Department of Justice operative. "You look more like yourself," Daniels commented, checking his watch. "I feel more like myself," Maya replied, adjusting her collar. She ran her fingers along the smooth fabric, remembering the feeling of being respected, of having power. They drove in silence to a nondescript government building on the outskirts of the city. Inside a conference room with blinds drawn tight, Daniels spread several files across the table. "Judge Ross reached out through official channels," he explained, pointing to a formal request letter. "He's asking for a private meeting. Just the two of you." Maya's eyebrows raised slightly. "No recording? No witnesses?" "That's his request. Holloway thinks it might be beneficial. Get him talking freely without the fear of immediate consequences." Daniels paused. "But it's your call. You've earned the right to refuse." Maya considered this, tapping her fingers thoughtfully on the table. "What's his state of mind?" "Devastated. The media is tearing him apart. His career is effectively over." Daniels handed her another file. "This is everything we have on his activities since the leak. He's been digging into his own past cases looking for similar patterns." Maya nodded slowly, a hint of satisfaction crossing her face. He's finally seeing the truth. "So, will you meet with him?" Maya walked to a full-length mirror mounted on the wall. She studied her reflection, the determined set of her jaw, the quiet strength in her eyes. The woman looking back at her was no longer playing a role. She was herself again, powerful and purposeful. "Yes," she said finally. "It's time he remembers who I really am." She straightened her jacket, her gaze unwavering in the mirror. The confrontation she had planned for years was finally at hand. At that moment, Judge Nathaniel Ross heard the soft thud of something landing on his front porch. The evening had grown dark, and he wasn't expecting any deliveries. Setting down his glass of whiskey, he approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole before opening it. No one was there. just a small brown package sitting on his welcome mat. Ross picked it up, turning it over in his hands. No return address, no postage. Someone had hand-delivered it and disappeared. Back in his living room, he carefully opened the package. Inside was a photograph that made his heart stop. A woman with kind eyes and a determined expression stared back at him. Rosa Jefferson. He remembered her face instantly, though it had been years since he'd seen her in his courtroom, pleading for justice he had refused to give. Beneath the photo was a sealed envelope. His fingers trembled as he opened it and read the handwritten note inside. "You buried the truth. Now it's digging its way back." The paper slipped from his fingers and floated to the floor. Ross sank into his chair, the weight of his past decisions crushing down on him. Rosa Jefferson's eyes in that photograph seemed to follow him, accusing him from beyond the grave. "I didn't know," he whispered to the empty room. "I truly didn't know." But even as he said it, he recognized the lie. He had suspected. He had chosen not to look deeper. And now, years later, the truth was indeed digging its way back to the surface. Meanwhile, across town, Maya Jefferson stood on the doorstep of a modest bungalow. The porch light cast a warm glow as Ruth Coleman opened the door, her face lighting up with recognition. "Maya!" Ruth exclaimed, pulling her into a tight hug. "I heard about your release on the news. Come in, please." Inside, Ruth's home was neat but simple. Photos of her children and grandchildren lined the walls, family she rarely got to see because of her conviction. "Coffee?" Ruth offered, her hands slightly shaking as she reached for cups. "That would be nice," Maya replied, taking a seat at the small kitchen table. As Ruth prepared the coffee, she kept glancing at Maya. "So it's true then? What they're saying about evidence being hidden in your case?" Maya nodded. "Not just mine, Ruth." Ruth's hands stilled. She set the coffee pot down and turned to face Maya, tears suddenly filling her eyes. "I always wondered about my own case." "Tell me," Maya said gently. Ruth sat down heavily. "The patient records they used to convict me. I always said they were altered. The medication dosages, the timing, none of it matched what I administered." Her voice broke. "Nobody believed me. Judge Ross dismissed my claims without even ordering an investigation." Tears streamed down Ruth's face now. "I lost my nursing license, my reputation, 5 years of my life. My husband left me while I was inside." Maya reached across the table and took Ruth's trembling hands in hers. "I believe you, Ruth, and I promise you, I'm going to reopen your case." Ruth looked up, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. "Can you really do that?" "Yes," Maya said firmly. "It's already happening. The same patterns of evidence suppression are appearing in dozens of cases, including yours." As they talked, neither woman noticed the curtain in the house across the street shift slightly. A neighbor watched intently as Maya's government-issued car sat in Ruth's driveway. When Maya finally stood to leave, the neighbor picked up a phone and dialed quickly. "She's here," the voice whispered. "Jefferson, at the Coleman woman's house. They've been talking for over an hour." On the other end, a man cursed softly. "Keep watching. Report any other visitors. We need to know who else she's connecting with." As Maya walked to her car, she glanced up at the night sky, unaware of the eyes tracking her movements from behind drawn curtains. In those days, shortly after Rosa Jefferson's arrest, 10-year-old Maya sat at the kitchen table, her small hands wrapped around a glass of milk she couldn't bring herself to drink. The television blared in the background, the evening news showing footage of her mother being led away in handcuffs. The defendant, Rosa Jefferson, was taken into custody today, charged with embezzling funds from her employer, the news anchor announced coldly. Maya's eyes never left the screen as they showed her mother's face, confused, frightened, but somehow still dignified. Her Aunt Vivian tried to turn off the TV, but Maya stopped her. "I need to see," Maya said, her voice small but firm. "Baby, this isn't something you should—" "She didn't do it," Maya interrupted. "Mom would never steal. Never." Aunt Vivian sat beside her, pulling Maya's thin shoulders close. I know that, honey. We all know that. On the screen, Rosa Jefferson was pushed into a police car. Just before they closed the door, she looked directly at the camera, as if she knew her daughter would be watching. Her lips formed words Maya could read even without sound. Stay strong. That night, Maya couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, looking out at the moon, making a silent promise to her mother. Someday she would fix this. Someday she would make it right. 7 years later, a 17-year-old Maya pushed open the door to the Women's Legal Aid Clinic. The small office was crowded with filing cabinets and worn furniture, but to Maya, it felt like stepping into her future. "You must be Maya," said Director Elaine Porter, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Your school counselor said you needed community service hours." "I need more than hours," Maya replied. "I need to learn." Elaine studied the teenager carefully. "This isn't glamorous work, mostly filing paperwork, maybe taking notes during client interviews." "My mother was wrongfully convicted," Maya said simply. "She died in prison 3 years ago. Heart attack, they said, but it was really a broken heart. I want to help women like her." Something in Maya's steady gaze made Elaine nod. "Come back tomorrow after school. We'll start you with the basics." Over the next year, Maya's anger slowly transformed into quiet determination. She absorbed everything: legal terms, procedural rules, the patterns of injustice that trapped women like her mother. Where other volunteers burned out, Maya's resolve only strengthened. On her last day before leaving for college, Elaine handed her a letter of recommendation. "Yale Law School is competitive," she said, "but if anyone can make it, it's you." Maya folded the letter carefully. "I'm going to change things, Ms. Porter, not just one case at a time, the whole system." Elaine smiled sadly. "That's a big promise, Maya." "It's not a promise," Maya replied. "It's a plan." 12 years later, Maya Jefferson sat in a windowless room at the Department of Justice. Across from her, Marcus Holloway slid a file across the table. "Judge Nathaniel Ross," Marcus said. "We've had suspicions about his courtroom for years. Evidence tampering, coerced pleas, racial disparities in sentencing." Maya opened the file, her face betraying nothing as she saw the judge's photograph. She had waited for this moment for 15 years. "Why me?" she asked, though she already knew. "Your record is impeccable. Yale Law Review, clerkship with Justice Ramirez, 3 years with the Public Defender's Office. You understand both sides of the system." Marcus paused. "And you have personal motivation." Maya looked up. "You know about my mother. Rosa Jefferson, convicted of embezzlement in 2008, died in custody in 2011. Marcus's voice softened. "Same judge, same prosecutor's office." Maya closed the file. "You want me to go undercover, to be convicted by the same man who sent my mother to her death?" "It's dangerous," Marcus admitted. "If they discover who you really are." "I'll do it," Maya interrupted. She straightened her tailored suit jacket. "I've been preparing for this my entire life." Marcus nodded slowly. "Your mother would be proud." Maya's eyes hardened. This isn't about making her proud. It's about making sure what happened to her never happens to anyone else again. Soon after her release, Maya Jefferson stepped out of the government building into the bright afternoon sunlight. Her eyes squinted against the glare as she adjusted the collar of her blazer. Freedom felt strange after months behind bars. She had just finished a debriefing with Marcus Holloway when a woman approached her, notebook in hand. "Ms. Jefferson, I'm Camilla Torres from the Justice Report." The reporter extended her hand. She was in her early 30s with intense dark eyes and a determined expression. "I've been following your case since the indictment. Would you consider giving me an exclusive interview?" Maya studied the reporter carefully. "You're the one who questioned the evidence gaps in the initial hearings." Camilla nodded. "I've been investigating judicial misconduct in this district for 3 years. Your case has all the hallmarks." She lowered her voice. "But there's more to it than just your story, isn't there?" Maya glanced at Marcus, who gave a subtle nod from a distance. "I'll do the interview," Maya said. "But I have one condition." "Name it." This can't just be about me. This has to focus on the system that failed me and countless others. Maya's voice remained steady. I'm not interested in being a sympathetic victim. I want to expose the pattern. Camilla's eyes lit up. That's exactly the angle I want to pursue. Within days, Maya sat across from Camilla in a small studio. Lights glared down as the camera operator counted down. Today we're speaking with Maya Jefferson, recently exonerated after being wrongfully convicted in Judge Nathaniel Ross's courtroom, Camilla began. Ms. Jefferson, thank you for being here. Thank you for focusing on what matters, Maya replied. The interview flowed naturally as Maya methodically outlined the failures in her case, the suppressed evidence, the rushed public defender, the racial undertones in the prosecution's language. This isn't just my story, Maya explained, her composure never wavering. For every case like mine that's exposed, dozens remain buried. My mother, Rosa Jefferson, died in prison after being wrongfully convicted in the same courtroom by the same judge. The camera zoomed in as Maya continued. Rosa Jefferson was a bookkeeper who noticed financial irregularities at her workplace. She reported them and was framed for the very crime she tried to prevent. Judge Ross sentenced her to 7 years. She died in year 3. By evening, the interview had gone viral. Social media exploded with hashtags, #Justice for Rosa and #The Ross Records. Other former defendants began coming forward with similar stories. In his darkened living room, Judge Nathaniel Ross sat alone, watching Maya's interview on his tablet. His hands trembled slightly as he poured another glass of scotch. When Maya spoke her mother's name, Rosa Jefferson, something broke inside him. I remember her, he whispered, his voice cracking. The glass slipped from his fingers, spilling across the hardwood floor. God help me, I remember her. Ross covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking as 15 years of carefully maintained certainty crumbled around him. The weight of lives destroyed under his gavel, lives he had convinced himself deserved their fate, crashed down all at once. What have I done? He whispered into the empty room. The memories washed over Judge Nathaniel Ross like a cold tide as he sat in his living room, Maya's interview still playing on the tablet. The name Rosa Jefferson had opened a door he'd kept locked for years. 15 years earlier, courtroom 302 had a different energy. Judge Nathaniel Ross, then in his early 40s with fewer gray hairs and sharper eyes, ran what courthouse staff called the express lane. His courtroom was notorious for its efficiency. Cases moved quickly, judgments came swiftly, and appeals rarely succeeded. Rosa Jefferson stood before him, her hands trembling as they rested on the defense table. Unlike her daughter, Rosa couldn't maintain composure. Her eyes were wide with fear, darting between the judge and her court-appointed lawyer who sat beside her, shuffling papers without making eye contact. Your Honor, I didn't do this, Rosa pleaded, her voice breaking. I was the one who reported the missing funds. Why would I report money I had stolen? Ross tapped his gavel lightly. Ms. Jefferson, please address the court through your attorney. Her public defender, a young man drowning in case files, barely looked up. We understand, Your Honor. Then you understand we're ready for sentencing, Ross replied coolly. Rosa's shoulders slumped as she realized no one was truly listening. The evidence against her seemed overwhelming. Her signature on transfer documents, her access to accounts, her financial troubles at home. What the court never saw were the original documents showing altered signatures and the email trail, where Rosa had flagged suspicious transactions weeks before her arrest. Later that same day, in his chambers, court clerk Julia Bennett approached Ross with a concerned expression. She was new, idealistic, and hadn't yet learned to keep her head down. Judge Ross, I found some inconsistencies in the Jefferson case files, she said, placing a folder on his desk. The prosecution's evidence doesn't match what was logged during discovery. Ross barely glanced at the papers. Ms. Bennett, justice is about efficiency. We can't reopen arguments every time someone spots a typo. But sir, these aren't typos, the dates don't align, and there's an entire email chain missing that the defense never received. Ross closed the folder and handed it back. The jury has spoken, Ms. Bennett. 7 years is already lenient for stealing from a women's shelter. Let it go." Julia took the folder, her expression hardening. "Yes, Your Honor." Back in the present, Ross's hands shook as he pulled the dusty box of archived files from the courthouse storage room. He'd used his judicial access card after hours, not wanting anyone to see what he was doing. Inside the box, Rosa Jefferson's case file looked thinner than he remembered. As he opened it, a small yellow note slipped out, handwriting he recognized as Julia Bennett's, who had left the courthouse shortly after Rosa's trial. The note was simple but devastating. "She warned you. You didn't listen." Ross sank into a nearby chair, the weight of the past crushing down on him. This wasn't some grand conspiracy he could blame on others. This was his negligence, his pride, his refusal to look deeper when it mattered. Rosa Jefferson had died in prison because he'd valued efficiency over justice. He placed his head in his hands, the yellow note still clutched between his fingers. The truth was worse than he'd feared. He hadn't just made a mistake, he had chosen not to see it. At midnight, the cemetery was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze. Judge Nathaniel Ross's car pulled up along the narrow gravel path, headlights cutting through the darkness before going dark. He sat motionless behind the wheel for several minutes, gathering courage for what he'd come to do. Finally, he stepped out, clutching a small bouquet of white lilies. The moonlight cast long shadows as he made his way between the rows of headstones, searching for one name. When he found Rosa Jefferson's grave, the simplicity of it struck him. A basic marker with her name, dates, and nothing more. No loving inscriptions, no mentions of her being a mother. Just another life, filed away and forgotten by the system. Ross knelt in the damp grass, placing the flowers against the stone. His hands trembled. "I don't know if you can hear me," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to say this anyway." Tears welled in his eyes as he continued. "I failed you, Mrs. Jefferson. I had the power to look deeper, to question what was put in front of me, and I chose not to." His voice cracked. "I valued my reputation for efficiency over actual justice." Ross wiped his eyes with his sleeve, looking around at the empty cemetery as if expecting judgment from the shadows. "Your daughter is extraordinary," he continued. "She's doing what I should have done 15 years ago. And I can't undo what happened to you, but I swear I'll help her now, no matter what it costs me." He stayed there talking to Rosa's headstone for nearly an hour, confessing every detail of his negligence, every warning sign he'd ignored. By the time he finished, his knees were soaked from the grass and his face was streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered one last time, touching the cold stone before rising to his feet. Across town, Maya Jefferson sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by case files. The clock on the wall showed it was past midnight, but sleep wasn't an option tonight. Tomorrow's meeting with Judge Ross required perfect preparation. She organized her notes methodically, testimonies from Ruth Coleman about falsified medical records, statements from Teresa Miles about evidence tampering in her drug possession case, and 6 other cases showing the same pattern of misconduct in Ross's courtroom. "These aren't isolated incidents," she murmured to herself, pinning another document to her evidence board. "This is systematic." Maya paused at a photograph of Ruth Coleman, the former nurse whose career and life had been destroyed by a conviction based on altered patient records. Ruth's tearful face when Maya had promised to help her was etched in her memory. One case at a time, Maya reminded herself, touching the photo gently. She'd promised Ruth her case would be reopened, and Maya Jefferson never broke a promise. She carefully arranged her materials for tomorrow's meeting, not just her own case, but evidence of a pattern spanning years. This wasn't about personal vindication anymore. It was about all the Rosa Jeffersons who never got justice. "She's becoming a problem we can't ignore," Councilman Douglas Ward said, pouring himself another whiskey in his wood-paneled home office. Alan Strick paced nervously, his usual courtroom confidence nowhere to be seen. "The media loves her. The wrongfully convicted lawyer fighting corruption narrative is gold to them." "Then change the narrative," Ward snapped. "I didn't finance 3 of your campaigns to watch you crumble at the first sign of trouble." Strick stopped pacing. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Discredit her. Find something in her past, her prison time, anything. Make the public question her motives. Ward's eyes narrowed. And remember, Strick, if she brings us down, we're taking you with us. The prosecutor swallowed hard, nodding. I understand. Good, Ward replied coldly. Because this isn't just about careers anymore. This is about survival. During the summer of 1965, the Alabama sun beat down mercilessly on the marchers. 8-year-old Rosa Jefferson clutched her father's hand tightly as they walked, her small legs working double time to keep up with the adults. Her father, William Jefferson, a quiet but determined man, had brought her despite her mother's concerns. She needs to see this, he had insisted. She needs to know what it means to stand for something. Maya Jefferson traced her finger over the faded black and white photograph of that day. Her mother, young and fierce, stood beside her grandfather, chin raised in defiance as police officers lined the street. The photograph had survived decades, prison transfers, and finally made its way back to Maya through a distant cousin. You were braver than I ever knew, Maya whispered to the image of her mother, noting how Rosa's hand was raised in a peace sign, even as tension visibly crackled through the crowd. Maya carefully placed the photograph in her briefcase alongside her prepared speech. Tonight's DOJ event wasn't just another function. It was her chance to connect her personal mission to the institutional one. The private Department of Justice reception hall hummed with conversation. High-ranking officials, attorneys, and select guests mingled over drinks and carefully plated appetizers. Maya stood at the podium, her professional demeanor masking the emotion churning inside her. Justice isn't an abstract concept, she began, her voice steady and clear. For some of us, it's as personal as the air we breathe. The room quieted as she continued. Systemic injustice wasn't born overnight. It grew over generations, becoming so familiar that many stopped seeing it altogether. Maya clicked to the next slide, the photograph of her mother at the Civil Rights March. This is my mother, Rosa Jefferson, summer of 1965. She was 8 years old, learning that standing for truth sometimes means standing against power. Her voice wavered slightly as she continued. 30 years later, that same woman, my mother, stood in a courtroom much like the ones where we work. Evidence was manipulated. Testimonies were coached, and a judge who valued efficiency over accuracy sentenced her to 12 years. Maya paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. She died in prison, not from violence but from untreated pneumonia, deemed non-urgent by prison medical staff. The room was completely silent now. I'm not sharing this for sympathy, Maya continued, her voice growing stronger. I'm sharing it because the corruption we're fighting isn't just about broken laws. It's about broken lives. And our work isn't just about punishment, it's about healing a system that has wounded too many for too long. Marcus Holloway, seated in the front row, nodded solemnly. As her DOJ supervisor, he had supported her undercover mission from the beginning, but even he hadn't heard the full emotional weight of her story until now. After the event, as attendees filed out with subdued conversations and thoughtful expressions, Marcus approached Maya with an envelope. This came to the office for you yesterday, he said quietly. It's been through security checks. Seems personal. Maya opened it carefully. Inside was a yellowed piece of paper folded in thirds. The handwriting was instantly recognizable, her mother's neat, precise script. Where did this come from? She asked, her hands trembling slightly. Former prison chaplain found it while cleaning out old files. Recognized your name from the news. Maya unfolded the note and read, My dearest Maya, if you're reading this, I'm gone, but you've continued our fight. Remember this always. Don't fight to punish. Fight to heal. The system breaks people on both sides of the bench. True justice mends what's broken. With eternal love, Mom. Maya pressed the note to her chest, tears filling her eyes. Her mother's wisdom, reaching across time and beyond death, had just clarified everything about her mission. The DOJ conference room was stark and silent, with only a single table between them. Maya Jefferson sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the polished wood surface. Across from her, Judge Nathaniel Ross looked smaller than he had on the bench, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes clouded with something between fear and resignation. Behind a one-way mirror, Marcus Holloway watched with arms crossed, ready to intervene if necessary, though he doubted it would be. This moment had been years in the making. Right then and there, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Maya spoke. Her voice was clear, controlled, but carried the weight of decades of pain. "You sent my mother to prison, and you sent me too." 5 simple words that connected their shared history in a way that could no longer be ignored. Ross flinched slightly but didn't look away. "I was 8 when my mother was taken from me. I was 32 when you sentenced me without looking closely enough at the evidence." Maya's voice didn't rise, but each word landed with precision. 2 generations, Judge Ross, 2 lives shaped by decisions you made in haste." Ross nodded slowly. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the table. "I remember Rosa," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I failed her, and I failed you." He looked directly into Maya's eyes. "There's no excuse I can offer that would matter." Maya reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. She opened it and began laying out documents one by one. Teresa Miles, wrongfully convicted of drug possession. Evidence planted by the same officer who testified against my mother. She placed another file beside it. Ruth Coleman, former nurse convicted of medical negligence. Key testimony from the hospital administrator was suppressed. Testimony that would have shown the hospital's faulty equipment was to blame. 2 more files joined the others. James Washington, Maria Diaz, both sentenced in your courtroom, both with evidence that never made it to trial. Ross stared at the files, his face ashen. "I didn't know." "That's the problem," Maya interrupted, her composure finally cracking slightly. "You didn't look. You didn't question. You trusted a system that was designed to process people, not protect them." Ross nodded, accepting her words without defense. Tears welled in his eyes but didn't fall. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Maya gathered the files, closing them with care, each one representing a life disrupted, a family torn apart. "You've already submitted your letter of resignation." "I know that." She looked at him steadily. "But I have a final request. Don't resign to escape guilt. Resign to open the door for change." Ross looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Make your resignation letter public. Name the prosecutors who suppressed evidence. Identify the patterns you've discovered. Don't just walk away. Help us fix what's broken." Eventually, Ross found himself standing on a small porch with peeling paint, clutching 2 sealed envelopes. His hand trembled slightly as he knocked on Ruth Coleman's door. When she opened it, her eyes widened with recognition, then narrowed with suspicion. "Judge Ross," she said, her voice tight. "What are you doing here?" "May I come in, Ms. Coleman?" he asked quietly. "I won't take much of your time." Ruth hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside her modest living room, Ross sat perched on the edge of a worn armchair, looking out of place in his expensive suit. "I've come to apologize," he said simply, "and to give you this." He handed her one of the envelopes. Inside was a handwritten letter acknowledging his failure to properly review the evidence in her case, along with his personal commitment to support her appeal. "This won't give you back the years you lost," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But it might help set the record straight." Ruth's hands shook as she read his words. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I finally learned to see," he replied. Later that same week, Ross made a similar visit to Teresa Miles. Her reaction was colder, her arms crossed defensively across her chest as she read his letter. "You think this fixes anything?" she asked. "No," Ross answered honestly. "But it's a start." As he left Teresa's apartment, he felt the weight of his failures pressing down on him. Yet with each step, there was also something else, a strange lightness that came with finally facing the truth. The community center buzzed with activity as people gathered for the Judicial Accountability Forum. Speakers from various advocacy groups discussed court reform and community oversight. Ross slipped in quietly, taking a seat in the back row. A woman in the middle of a presentation paused, noticing him. "Judge Ross?" I didn't realize you were on the panel today." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. "I'm not," he said simply. "I'm here to listen." Whispers rippled through the audience. Some faces showed hostility, others curiosity. Ross remained seated, notebook open, pen ready. For 3 hours, he wrote down every criticism, every suggestion, every personal story of injustice. He didn't defend himself once. When a young law student asked him why he was there, Ross looked at her directly. "Because I've spent too many years talking," he said. "It's time I learned to listen." Back in his chambers, Ross sat at his desk for the last time. The room had been mostly packed up, personal items boxed away. Only his pen and official letterhead remained. "Dear Judicial Review Board," he wrote, his penmanship careful and deliberate. He detailed his failures, named the prosecutors who had suppressed evidence, and outlined the systemic problems he had uncovered. When he finished the formal resignation, he reached for a separate envelope. Inside, he placed a recommendation letter for Maya Jefferson, suggesting her appointment to lead the newly proposed Judicial Equity Task Force. "Ms. Jefferson possesses what I lacked," he wrote, "the courage to question authority and the wisdom to use power for healing rather than punishment." He sealed both envelopes, placed them carefully in his outbox, and looked around the empty office one last time. Chapter 21. At Sunrise. At sunrise, Maya Jefferson sat in a corner booth at Riverside Cafe, watching the golden lights spill across the quiet street outside. The cafe was nearly empty at this early hour, just as she had planned. She wrapped her hands around a steaming mug of coffee, her posture calm but alert. The bell above the door jingled softly. Valerie Lynn entered, looking smaller somehow than she had in the courthouse. Her eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on Maya. She approached the table hesitantly. "Thank you for meeting me," Valerie said, her voice barely above a whisper as she slid into the seat across from Maya. "I appreciate you reaching out," Maya replied, her tone measured and even. The waitress brought Valerie a cup of tea, then retreated. In the silence that followed, Valerie's hands trembled slightly as she added sugar to her cup. "I need to tell you something," Valerie finally said, tears welling in her eyes. "I wasn't just a court assistant. Strick placed me there specifically to monitor your trial. I was reporting back to the prosecution team." Maya remained still, her face revealing nothing. "I was supposed to keep an eye on Ross, make sure he didn't look too closely at certain evidence," Valerie continued, a tear sliding down her cheek. "But when I saw what they were doing to you, how they twisted everything, I couldn't be part of it anymore. That's why I quit." Maya took a slow sip of her coffee before responding. "I suspected something like that." "I'm so sorry," Valerie whispered, wiping her eyes. "I didn't know at first how deep it went. When I realized, I was scared to speak up." "Fear is a powerful tool," Maya said softly. "That's how men like Strick operate." Valerie looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. "I kept copies of everything. Documents Strick told me to lose, notes about which witnesses were pressured. I thought someday I might be brave enough to use them." Maya reached across the table and gently touched Valerie's hand. "I forgive you, Valerie. What matters now is what you choose to do next." "What can I do?" Valerie asked. "Testify," Maya said simply. "Help me expose Strick's manipulation. Your insider knowledge could be the key to bringing this whole system down." Valerie's face paled. "He'll destroy me." "Not if we get to him first," Maya assured her. "You won't be alone in this." After a long moment, Valerie straightened her shoulders. "Okay," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'll do it. I'll testify." Across town, Alan Strick slammed his office door so hard the framed law degree on his wall tilted askew. "What do you mean they're reviewing my cases?" he demanded into his phone. "Who authorized this?" The voice on the other end delivered more unwelcome news, and Strick's face darkened further. He ended the call with a curse and immediately dialed Councilman Douglas Ward. "We have a problem," Strick said when Ward answered. "The Justice Department is reopening investigations into at least 5 of my major convictions. I need you to make some calls, pull some strings." "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Alan," Ward replied, his tone distinctly cooler than usual. "What are you talking about? We had an arrangement." "Had is the operative word," Ward said. "The political winds are shifting. I've received inquiries from the State Ethics Committee myself." "So you're just going to hang me out to dry?" Strick's voice rose dangerously. "I prefer to think of it as a strategic realignment of priorities," Ward replied smoothly. "My advice? Hire a good attorney." The line went dead. Strick stared at his phone in disbelief, then hurled it across the room. The walls he had built so carefully around himself were beginning to crumble, and for the first time in his career, Alan Strick felt truly afraid. Days turned into weeks as Maya Jefferson settled into her new role at the DOJ task force. Her small office gradually transformed into a command center of sorts. Stacks of case files lined the walls, color-coded tabs marking patterns of misconduct. Each morning she arrived before sunrise, methodically working through thousands of pages of court transcripts, police reports, and witness testimonies. "You need to take a break sometime," said Marcus Holloway, leaning against her doorframe one evening. Maya looked up from her computer, rubbing her tired eyes. "There are too many cases, Marcus. Too many lives affected." "That's why we're building a team," he reminded her gently. "This isn't just on your shoulders anymore." Maya nodded, glancing at the whiteboard where she'd outlined her reform model. It focused on 3 pillars: accountability, transparency, and community oversight. What had begun as her personal mission was evolving into something much larger, a blueprint for systemic change. "We're presenting to the Attorney General next week," she said, determination replacing her fatigue. "These aren't just recommendations. This is a roadmap for real transformation." Across town in a cramped office at the public defender's headquarters, Nathaniel Ross carefully reviewed appeal documents. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the clock neared midnight. Most of the staff had gone home hours ago. "Mr. Ross, you don't have to stay this late," said Tanya Webb, a young public defender who'd taken him under her wing. "These cases will still be here tomorrow." Ross looked up with a tired smile. "I know, but Mrs. Johnson's hearing is tomorrow, and I want to make sure we haven't missed anything." He no longer introduced himself as Judge Ross. That title belonged to a different life. Now, he was simply Nathaniel, a volunteer legal assistant working in the shadows of the system he once commanded. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent decades looking down from the bench, and now he saw the justice system from its foundation. "This appeal has merit," he said, pointing to a highlighted paragraph. "The arresting officer's testimony contradicts the body camera footage." Tanya nodded. "Good catch. I'll add it to our arguments." Ross felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with power or prestige. This work, patient, unglamorous, essential, felt more like justice than anything he'd done in his former life. The auditorium was packed for the National Judicial Reform Conference. Cameras lined the back wall as Maya Jefferson approached the podium. The journey from wrongfully convicted prisoner to DOJ task force leader had been extraordinary, but Maya carried herself with the same quiet dignity she'd always possessed. "True justice," she began, her voice clear and strong, "isn't about vengeance or punishment. It's about responsibility, collective responsibility." The audience listened intently as Maya outlined the findings of her task force and their recommendations for reform. She spoke of accountability systems, of community oversight boards, of transparent processes. "For too long, we've accepted a system that crushes some while elevating others," she continued. "We've confused justice with punishment and power with righteousness." In the back row, Nathaniel Ross watched silently, just another face in the crowd. "Justice is not punishment, it's responsibility. For all of us," Maya concluded. "The work begins now, and it belongs to each of us." The crowd rose in applause, a standing ovation that echoed through the hall. Maya stood tall at the podium, no longer defined by what had been done to her, but by what she was building for others. At that moment, during the Public Reform Summit, the atmosphere in the auditorium shifted as Maya Jefferson approached the microphone again. The crowd, still on their feet from her keynote address, grew quiet with anticipation. Today isn't just about policy changes, Maya said, her voice clear and steady. It's about the lives behind the statistics. She gestured toward the side of the stage. I'd like to introduce someone whose story matters deeply to our work. Ruth Coleman walked slowly onto the stage, her hands trembling slightly. The former nurse, once convicted of medical negligence in Judge Ross's courtroom, stood tall despite her nervousness. This is Ruth Coleman, Maya announced. Her case was among the first we re-examined. Ruth spent 3 years in prison for a crime that never happened. Ruth stepped forward, adjusting the microphone. I was a nurse for 27 years, she began, her voice gaining strength with each word. I lost my career, my home, and my reputation because evidence was altered in my case. She paused, taking a deep breath. But today I'm not here to talk about what I lost. I'm here to talk about second chances. The audience listened in rapt silence as Ruth described rebuilding her life, her recent reinstatement to the nursing registry, and her commitment to helping others wrongfully convicted. Justice isn't just about clearing your name, Ruth concluded, tears streaming down her face. It's about restoring dignity and purpose. Thanks to Maya and this task force, I have both again. The applause was thunderous, punctuated by sniffles throughout the crowd. In the back row of the auditorium, Nathaniel Ross stood quietly, wiping moisture from his eyes. He had deliberately chosen an inconspicuous seat, wanting to witness but not distract from the proceedings. Judge Ross? He turned to find Camila Torres, microphone in hand, her cameraman a few steps behind. Ms. Torres, he acknowledged with a small nod. May I ask you a few questions? She asked, keeping her voice low. Ross hesitated, then nodded. Briefly. Why are you here today? Camila asked, studying his face carefully. Ross looked toward the stage where Ruth was now embracing Maya. To witness what I nearly destroyed, he answered simply. Do you regret your time on the bench? I regret my blindness, he replied. I was so focused on the letter of the law that I forgot its purpose. People like Ruth Coleman paid the price for my failure. Camila nodded thoughtfully. Will you be making a public statement about your role in these cases? This isn't about me, Ross said firmly. It's about them, the people whose lives were derailed. My job now is to listen and support their voices, not center my own. The summit reached its climactic moment when Valerie Lynn took the stage. The former court assistant looked nervous but determined as she faced the audience and the panel of DOJ officials. I was instructed to modify records, she testified, her voice slightly shaky but resolute. Prosecutor Alan Strick directly pressured me to remove exculpatory evidence from multiple case files. She presented printed emails and text messages on the large screen behind her. When I questioned these practices, I was reminded that my career depended on being a team player. The audience murmured as particularly damning exchanges appeared on screen. Ms. Lynn, asked the lead DOJ investigator, why did you decide to come forward now? Valerie glanced at Maya before answering. Because silence makes us complicit. I couldn't live with that anymore. As Valerie concluded her testimony, a DOJ official approached the microphone. Based on Ms. Lynn's evidence and corroborating testimony, we are formally opening an investigation into prosecutorial misconduct by Alan Strick and others involved in these cases. The announcement sent ripples through the audience. What had begun as one woman's fight for justice was now dismantling an entire system of corruption. On that very night, while the city lights glimmered against the darkening sky, Alan Strick adjusted his bow tie in the mirror of his car. The fundraiser gala for the district attorney's office was in full swing, and he was fashionably late, just as he preferred. The event's red carpet entrance would give him the visibility he craved, especially now that he needed to shore up political support. As he stepped out of his luxury sedan, camera flashes immediately caught his attention. Strick smiled reflexively, straightening his tuxedo jacket. But his smile faltered when he noticed the photographers weren't the usual society page journalists. Alan Strick, a stern voice called out. A woman in a dark suit approached, flanked by 2 agents. Department of Justice, we have a warrant for your arrest. Strick's face drained of color. This is absurd. Do you know who I am? Yes, sir. That's precisely why we're here. The agents moved forward with handcuffs as guests began to gather at the entrance, murmuring and pointing. Cameras captured every moment as the once powerful prosecutor was read his rights. Evidence tampering, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, the agent recited, each charge landing like a hammer blow. A news van pulled up, and Camila Torres emerged with her crew, capturing the moment that would lead every broadcast by morning. The man who had built his career sending others to prison was now facing the same fate himself. Meanwhile, across town, Maya sat at her kitchen table sorting through mail when an envelope with a prison postmark caught her eye. She opened it carefully, unfolding the simple lined paper inside. "Dear Maya," the letter began in neat handwriting. "By the time you read this, I'll be walking out those gates. My case review was approved yesterday. Thank you for not forgetting us. When you were in here with me, I thought you were just another inmate with big dreams. Now I know you were our miracle. I'm going to stay with my sister while I figure out what's next. Maybe I'll finish that GED like we talked about. You showed me it's never too late to start over. With endless gratitude, Teresa Miles." Maya pressed the letter to her heart, tears welling in her eyes. This was why she had done it all, not for vengeance, but for Teresa and Ruth and countless others whose lives had been stolen by a broken system. She reached for her phone to call Marcus Holloway with the good news about Teresa's release when a text alert appeared. "Strick in custody. It's happening." Across the city, Nathaniel Ross returned home after a long day at the public defender's office. A small package waited on his doorstep, unmarked except for his name. Inside was a simple envelope containing a handwritten note on cream-colored stationery. "Judge Ross," it read in Maya's distinctive handwriting. "You were part of my story. Now make sure others aren't forgotten in theirs. The work of justice is never complete, only passed forward. Maya Jefferson." Ross sat heavily in his armchair, reading the note 3 times. He understood its meaning perfectly. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but something perhaps more valuable: purpose. Maya was entrusting him with continuing the work of redemption, not just for himself but for others still trapped in the system he once upheld without question. He carefully placed the note in his wallet, where he would carry it as a daily reminder of both his failure and his promise. After a while, Maya Jefferson stood in the sunlit lobby of the Rosa Jefferson Community Legal Center, her fingers trailing over the bronze plaque that bore her mother's name. 6 months of renovations had transformed the old community center into a beacon of hope, a place where wrongfully convicted women could find legal help, housing assistance, and emotional support after release. "What do you think, Mom?" Maya whispered to herself, gazing at her mother's photo on the wall. Rosa's gentle smile seemed to approve of all that had been accomplished. The center bustled with activity. Volunteer lawyers reviewed cases at desks, counselors met with clients in glass-walled offices, and in the computer lab, former inmates learned digital skills for their new lives. Maya had designed every aspect of the space to feel welcoming rather than institutional. Warm colors, comfortable furniture, and natural light streaming through large windows. "Ms. Jefferson?" A young law student approached with a clipboard. "Everyone's gathered in the community room for the ceremony." Maya nodded, straightening her simple blue dress. "Thank you, Ellie. I'll be right there." The community room was filled with smiling faces when Maya entered. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows, and a small podium stood at the front. 5 women sat in a special section, each wearing a new outfit and a nervous smile. Today marked their official welcome back to society after their wrongful convictions had been overturned. Ruth Coleman stood at the podium, her gray hair now styled in a modern cut that took years off her appearance. The former nurse spoke with newfound confidence. "When I was released, I had nowhere to go and no idea how to start over," Ruth said, her voice steady. "But this center gave me purpose again. Next month, I'll be starting a job at the community health clinic, using my nursing skills to help others." The room erupted in applause as Ruth took her seat. Teresa Miles went next, her once timid demeanor replaced by quiet strength. "I got my GED last week," Teresa announced, holding up her certificate as cheers filled the room. "And I've applied to community college for the fall. Maya taught me that our past doesn't have to be our future." Maya watched with pride as Teresa and Ruth embraced. These women weren't just survivors anymore. They were becoming leaders, mentors to others walking the same difficult path. When Maya's turn came to speak, a commotion at the back of the room caught her attention. A woman was guiding a small girl, no more than 8 years old, toward an empty seat. "Before I begin," Maya said, "I want to remind everyone why we're here. Not just to celebrate freedom, but to remember those still waiting for justice." After the ceremony, as people mingled over refreshments, Maya felt a tug on her sleeve. The little girl from earlier looked up at her with solemn brown eyes. "Are you Ms. Jefferson?" the child asked, her voice barely audible. Maya knelt down to eye level. "I am. What's your name?" "Tasha. My mommy is still in prison. They say she did something bad, but she didn't." Tears welled in the girl's eyes as she clutched a worn photograph. "Can you help my mom too?" Maya gently took Tasha's small hand in hers. The child's fingers were warm and trusting, a reminder of everything at stake in her work. "We'll do everything we can," Maya promised, her voice soft but resolute. "That's why we're here, Tasha, to help families like yours find their way back together." At dusk, Judge Nathaniel Ross stood outside the courthouse where he had once presided, watching as the setting sun cast long shadows across the marble steps. The building looked the same, imposing columns, heavy wooden doors, but everything else had changed, including him. He entered quietly, passing through the security checkpoint without announcing his former title. The guard barely glanced at him, just another visitor in a simple suit with graying hair and humbled eyes. Courtroom 3, his old domain, was now under the leadership of Judge Diana Chen, a 40-year-old reformist known for her commitment to fair sentencing and procedural transparency. Ross slipped into the back row of the gallery, taking a seat on the hard wooden bench where families of defendants had sat during his tenure. Judge Chen was hearing a drug possession case. The defendant, a young woman with nervous hands, listened as her public defender argued passionately about rehabilitative alternatives to incarceration. Ross noticed how Judge Chen asked thoughtful questions, taking time to consider each response. "The defendant's circumstances meet the criteria established in the Ross-Jefferson Guidelines for Case Review," the public defender stated, referencing the new protocol named partly after him, a fact that still surprised Ross whenever he heard it. When the hearing concluded with a rehabilitation-focused sentence rather than jail time, Ross felt a weight lift from his chest. This was justice with compassion, what he should have practiced all along. As people filed out of the courtroom, Ross remained seated, lost in thought. He didn't notice the young public defender approaching until the man stood directly before him. "Judge Ross," the attorney said quietly. He was barely 30, with earnest eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Ross looked up, surprised to be recognized. "I'm not a judge anymore," he replied gently. "I know," the young man said, "but your research saved my client today." He gestured toward the door where his client had exited. "The precedent review you compiled on bias and first-time drug offenses was crucial to our case." Ross simply nodded, humbled and grateful that his work in the shadows was making a difference. After years of harmful rulings, each case helped by his research felt like a small step toward redemption. "Thank you for letting me know," Ross said softly. Outside the courthouse, the evening air had grown cool. Ross pulled his jacket closer and reached for his phone. He scrolled to a number he'd called only twice before, taking a deep breath before pressing dial. "Maya Jefferson," her clear voice answered on the third ring. "Maya, it's Nathaniel Ross. I just sat in on a case that used our guidelines." For the first time, they spoke not as adversaries but as allies. The awkwardness of their earlier conversations had faded into something resembling professional respect. "The Chen courtroom?" Maya asked. "Yes. A young woman was given rehabilitation instead of incarceration. Your mother would have been proud of what's happening there now." There was a pause before Maya replied. "You've done more than resign. You've helped rebuild." Ross watched the courthouse lights glowing against the darkening sky. "I couldn't have without you," he admitted. "Your courage made all of this possible." As time passed, Maya Jefferson found herself drawn to the place she had avoided for years. The next morning, Just as the cemetery gates opened, she parked her car along the quiet path and walked slowly toward the eastern section where her mother rested. Rosa Jefferson's headstone was simple, gray marble with clean lettering that caught the morning light. Maya carried a small bouquet of yellow daisies, her mother's favorite. She placed them gently against the stone and lowered herself to her knees on the dewy grass. "You didn't die in vain, Mama," she whispered, tracing her mother's name with trembling fingers. "The system that took you is finally changing." The morning breeze rustled the leaves of a nearby oak tree. Maya closed her eyes, remembering her mother's laugh, her gentle hands, the bedtime stories about justice warriors who never gave up. For the first time since Rosa's passing, Maya felt no anger here, only a profound, aching love. She didn't notice the approaching footsteps until they stopped several yards away. When she looked up, Judge Nathaniel Ross stood there, holding a single white rose. He wore no tie, no formal clothes, just a simple sweater and slacks. His face showed uncertainty, as if he might have made a mistake in coming. Maya studied him for a moment, then gestured for him to approach. "How did you know I'd be here?" she asked softly. "I didn't," Ross admitted, stepping closer. "I come every month since I learned the truth. I never expected to find you here today." He knelt awkwardly beside Maya, his knees creaking slightly as he placed the white rose alongside Maya's daisies. "She deserves so much better," he said, his voice barely audible. Maya nodded, reaching into her pocket to withdraw a folded, yellowed piece of paper. "This was her last letter to me from prison. I've carried it everywhere." She carefully unfolded the paper, its creases worn from years of opening and closing. Taking a deep breath, Maya read aloud, "May justice not be a weapon, but a light." Ross closed his eyes, tears forming at the corners. A single drop traced down his weathered cheek. "She wrote that 3 weeks before she died," Maya continued. "She never knew how her words would shape my entire life." They stood together in silence as the wind blew softly across the cemetery, rustling the flowers against Rosa's stone. No words seemed necessary or adequate in that moment, just the shared acknowledgement of a life lost and the commitment to honor its meaning. Maya carefully refolded the letter and returned it to her pocket. Ross wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, making no attempt to hide his emotion. The morning sun climbed higher, warming their shoulders as they stood side by side before Rosa Jefferson's grave, united by her memory and her wisdom. In the months that followed, Maya Jefferson's work grew beyond the confines of her personal story. Her task force, once a small initiative, blossomed into a nationally recognized movement for judicial reform. She traveled from state to state, her quiet intensity commanding attention in legislative halls and community centers alike. "The system didn't break overnight," Maya would explain to packed auditoriums in Detroit, Phoenix, and Atlanta. "It won't be fixed overnight either, but every case we review brings another family closer to healing." Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from DOJ colleagues, former inmates seeking guidance, and legislators requesting consultation. The Rosa Jefferson Community Legal Center became a model that other cities began to replicate, with Maya providing the framework and training for each new location. During a conference in Chicago, Maya sat beside Ruth Coleman and Teresa Miles as they shared their stories with state officials. The three women, once bound by prison walls, now traveled together when possible, creating a powerful testimony that few could ignore. "Maya taught us that our pain has purpose," Ruth told the audience, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Now we're teaching others." In the meantime, Nathaniel Ross had quietly disappeared from public life. His resignation from the bench had made headlines for a week before the news cycle moved on. He declined interviews and avoided legal circles where he had once been celebrated. Instead, Ross found himself standing before a different audience, 24 students in a community college classroom where he now taught ethics and legal procedure. The walls were bare except for a framed copy of the Constitution and student projects analyzing landmark cases. "A courtroom is a place of power," Ross told his students during a Wednesday afternoon lecture. "Never forget that it belongs to the people." The students scribbled notes, many of them working adults seeking second careers or those who couldn't afford traditional law school. Ross had requested this specific demographic when accepting the position. Justice isn't abstract, he continued, pacing slowly between the desks. It lives or dies in the small choices we make every day, the evidence we consider, the voices we amplify or silence. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Professor Ross, is it true you were the judge in the Jefferson case? The one that's in our textbook now?" Ross nodded, his expression solemn. "Yes, and that's why I'm here, to ensure what I failed to see becomes visible to all of you." The classroom door opened quietly, and heads turned as Maya Jefferson slipped into the back row. She wore a simple blazer over jeans, her hair pulled back in its characteristic neat bun. The students began whispering immediately, recognizing her from news coverage and their textbook chapter. Ross paused mid-sentence, surprise evident on his face. He hadn't seen Maya since their moment at the cemetery 3 months earlier. "Please," Maya said with a small smile, "don't stop on my account. I just came to listen." The students broke into spontaneous applause, several pulling out phones to capture the moment. Here were two people whose conflict and reconciliation had become a case study in judicial reform, sharing the same room not as adversaries but as allies in education. Ross recovered his composure and gestured toward Maya. "Ms. Jefferson's work has transformed how we approach judicial accountability in this country. Her presence here is an honor we didn't expect." Maya nodded acknowledgement but remained seated, taking out a notebook as if she were simply another student. The gesture wasn't lost on the class, or on Ross. As the lecture continued, Ross found himself speaking with renewed purpose, knowing that Maya was evaluating his teachings. The students seemed energized by her presence, asking more questions and engaging more deeply with the material. When class ended, students gathered around Maya, asking for advice and sharing their own stories of encountering the justice system. She listened to each one with genuine attention, the same quality that had helped her survive her time in prison. "Your professor," Maya told a group of students as Ross packed up his materials, "is teaching you something textbooks can't: how to recognize your own biases before they harm others." Ross looked up, meeting Maya's eyes across the room. Between them passed an understanding that transcended words. Their individual journeys had become something larger than themselves, a lesson for those who would shape tomorrow's justice system. At that moment, as Maya Jefferson stepped into the grand ballroom of the Washington Convention Center for the National Justice Symposium, she had no idea what awaited her. The room buzzed with energy. Judges, lawmakers, advocates, and reformers gathered from across the country. Maya spotted familiar faces: Ruth Coleman and Teresa Miles sitting near the front, Marcus Holloway from the DOJ standing by the podium, and scattered throughout the crowd, women whose cases she had helped overturn. The Attorney General approached the microphone, gesturing for silence. "Before we continue with our scheduled program, I have an announcement of historic significance." Maya felt a hand touch her shoulder. Camila Torres, the reporter who had first amplified her story, whispered, "You might want to move closer to the stage." Confused, Maya made her way forward as the Attorney General continued. "Moments ago, the President signed into law the Rosa Jefferson Act, mandating automatic review of all cases involving sealed evidence and establishing the National Judicial Transparency Commission." The room erupted in applause. Maya froze, her mother's name echoing in her ears. On the large screen behind the stage appeared footage of the president signing the bill, flanked by lawmakers and advocates. The camera panned to show a framed photograph of Rosa Jefferson placed prominently on the desk. "Maya Jefferson," the Attorney General called out, "would you please join us? This moment belongs to you and your mother." Stunned, Maya walked to the stage as the audience rose in a standing ovation. Her hands trembled as she approached the microphone, unprepared for this moment. She began, her voice catching. She took a deep breath and continued, "I came here today as just another advocate. I never imagined hearing my mother's name become part of our nation's legal framework." The room quieted as Maya found her strength. "This isn't just about my mother or me. This is about everyone who lost their voices to silence. Teresa Miles, who spent 8 years in prison because a lab report was hidden. Ruth Coleman, a nurse convicted because patient records were altered, and thousands more whose names we may never know. Maya's eyes scanned the crowd, her voice growing more powerful. Justice isn't a single verdict. It's a continuous commitment to truth. The system didn't fail because one judge or prosecutor made a mistake. It failed because we accepted a culture of convenience over accuracy, efficiency over humanity. In the middle of the audience, Nathaniel Ross stood quietly, listening intently. His face showed the weight of every word she spoke. "We cannot undo the past," Maya continued, tears glistening in her eyes. "But we can choose the future. The Rosa Jefferson Act isn't the end of our work. It's the beginning." As she finished speaking, a single person began to applaud, Nathaniel Ross standing tall in the center of the room. One by one, others joined until the entire hall thundered with applause. Maya locked eyes with Ross across the distance. In that moment, something profound passed between them. Acknowledgement of their journey from adversaries to allies in reform. She nodded slightly, and he returned the gesture. This wasn't just a victory for legislation. It was their shared moment of healing, witnessed by hundreds who would carry the story forward. The woman who had been wrongfully imprisoned and the judge who had failed her mother now stood united in purpose, if not in position. Symbols of how justice could bend toward redemption when truth was finally given voice. Eventually, Maya's life found a new rhythm. 6 months after the Rosa Jefferson Act passed, she drove down a familiar street to the women's shelter where her case had begun. The weathered brick building looked different now, freshly painted with colorful murals decorating the walls. A new sign hung above the entrance, "The Rosa Home." Maya parked her car and sat for a moment, remembering the day police had escorted her out in handcuffs, accused of stealing from this very place. Now she returned as a newly appointed board member, invited to help guide its future. "Never thought I'd be back here like this," she whispered to herself, smoothing her blazer as she walked toward the entrance. Inside, the shelter hummed with activity. Women gathered in the main hall for a legal empowerment seminar, many taking careful notes. At the front of the room stood Ruth Coleman, her silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly, explaining tenant rights with the confidence of someone who had found her purpose. "Remember," Ruth was saying, "no one can evict you without proper notice. Know your rights." Teresa Miles circulated through the room, distributing pamphlets and answering questions. When she spotted Maya in the doorway, her face lit up. "Our guest of honor is here," Teresa announced, causing heads to turn. Maya smiled and waved, but gestured for them to continue. She slipped through a side door that led to the garden, once just a patch of weedy ground, now transformed into a vibrant play area where children laughed and chased each other around colorful playground equipment. A little girl with braided hair approached Maya. "Are you the lady from the pictures inside? The one who helped make the shelter bigger?" Maya knelt down to meet her eyes. "I'm Maya. What's your name?" "Zoe. My mom says you're the reason we have our own room now." Maya's throat tightened with emotion. "Well, Zoe, lots of people worked together to make that happen." As the afternoon wore on, Maya joined the seminar, listening more than speaking. She watched Ruth and Teresa guide these women with such gentle strength, both of them transformed from victims into leaders. When the session ended, Maya helped clean up while the mothers collected their children from the garden. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn as she gathered her things to leave. The shelter director handed her an envelope. "This came for you yesterday." Inside was a simple handwritten letter on plain paper. Maya recognized the careful penmanship immediately. "I was the judge once, now I'm just a man learning to do better, thank you. Nathaniel Ross." Maya folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. She walked back to the garden where a few children still played as twilight approached. Watching them, she smiled softly, thinking of her mother, of Ross, of the long journey that had led her here. The circle had closed, not with vengeance but with healing, not with punishment, but with purpose. If you enjoyed the story of Judge Nathaniel and Maya, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. If you enjoyed the story of Judge Nathaniel and Maya, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.